think we're live. Are we live?
I think we are.
Good.
I think so. But if we're not, we'll just talk to each other.
We just have a natter. That'll be all right, won't it? Do you think we ought to introduce ourselves just in case people might have gone to the wrong chat?
Yes, after you.
Okay. Well, I'm Graham Bartlett. I am an author, police procedural and crime advisor to authors, and in a previous life, I was a police officer. That's me.
I'm Tony Kent. I am a barrister under an entirely different name. But as Tony Kent, I am a thriller writer. I've written the Joe Dempsey.
We have lost Tony.
Have you?
I'm going to just take him out and hope he pops back in again. In the meantime, do you want to tell us more about your books, Graham?
Okay, yeah. So it's just me now, is it? Sorry about this, everybody. If you thought you were going to get someone interesting, you're stuck with me for a bit. So I have been writing true crime, non-fiction, and I've written two books, both with a chap called Peter James, who some of you may know. The first one, Death Comes Knocking. That's the wrong one. That's the story of, you see I've got no hand-eye coordination. Those are the stories that influence the Roy Grace stories, which obviously now are not only successful novels by Peter James, but also a TV series as well, which is filming its second series now. So that was I'm just filling at the moment, Tony.
Filling until I disappear again.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's listening or not, but we'll see. And the second one is Babes in the Wood, which is a horrific case, a double child murder in the 80s. And it tells a story about how the killer was acquitted, went on to offend again, and was eventually caught through a change of law and an improvement in forensics. So they're both out, and that's my plugging done. I suppose you ought to do yours then, hadn't you, Tony? It's not all about me.
You're much more efficient than me because I didn't bring any books to show to the screen to plug.
People don't need to see your books; they know your books.
If you look behind me, you'll see some James Bond posters, and I think that the stuff that I write, or certainly the most recent few, probably the closest thing to it is James Bond. So if you're into that, then hopefully you'll like the Joe Dempsey novels, which are the thrillers that I write. Joe Dempsey and Michael Devlin and Sarah Truman, I guess, are the three lead characters. First one was Killer Intent, which was a Zoe Ball book club pick in 2018. Second was Marked for Death, which was a legal thriller, which was a Richard and Judy book club pick in 2019. Power Play, which came out last April in the second week of the first lockdown. And therefore nobody bought it because anyone going into the supermarket was finding tins where the bookshelves were normally to be found. And unfortunately, the bookshops were closed and we were all using Amazon to buy bread. So hopefully that will be coming out again next year. In the meantime, in November, we are releasing my fourth book, which is No Way to Die, which is a Bond-esque Joe Dempsey thriller set in Florida and beyond.
So it's interesting that you describe them as Joe Dempsey books, because the first one of yours I read, and you mentioned the Richard and Judy book club, was Marked for Death.
Yeah.
And that was very much a Devlin book. So I've always considered them to be Devlin books. But it's interesting that you put Joe Dempsey first, because he's obviously the US intelligence operative, isn't he?
Well, I think that they've kind of gone that way. The first book that I wrote with Killer Intent was Michael and Joe, very, very 50-50. And I didn't really intend for it to be one or the other's books. But then when I read it back, I realised it's very much Michael Devlin's book. Joe Dempsey's doing his job and Michael Devlin is going home to his family. So yeah, you do find a lot more about Michael, even though it's a 50-50 split of action. And then you're right, Marked for Death I never intended to write another Michael Devlin book, and someone really liked him and suggested that I should, and said, that's your really original character, so go with that. Yeah. And I wrote Marked for Death based on something that actually almost really happened to a barrister friend of mine.
Oh, really?
Which is where the inspiration came from. So I wrote that, and that was purely Michael. I mean, I think Joe Dempsey's in it at the end of a phone in one chapter. But then the third book, Power Play, is very much intentionally Joe Dempsey's Killer Intent. It's much more about him. He's in it more than Michael. You learn a lot more about him. You get to know him as a character. And then again, like Mark for Death, it switches on its head. The fourth book, Michael Devlin's not in it at all, which is the one that's coming out. Yeah. And then the fifth book I'm writing now is again a 50-50 between the two of them. So it's almost like a universe really than a series. It's jumping between them. And I always say my sort of slight inspiration is the way they've managed to do the Marvel universe, where they all share the same world, but they'll have their own adventures and stories that don't involve one another.
Oh, fabulous! I don't because I've read Mark for Death and Power Play, and I just thought when I picked up Power Play, I thought, blimey, this is different. You know, they've got this chap Dempsey in there, and I didn't realise because I've not read Killer Intent, slap my wrists, that he was actually, you know, one of the lead characters. So I'll go back and read Killer Intent, and then I'll read, because I understand you got caught out by Amazon this week in revealing your book, your title and cover. Did you? We did.
Amazon published it, and then there is a blogger who follows quite a lot of thriller writers called Sergit, and he found it immediately somehow. I don't know if he's got some kind of notification lined up, and then he posted it. So thanks, Sergit. I mean, again, not criticising you or moaning at all. It's great. It was out there, so thank you very much. Yeah. I thought I'd better post it as well, and now my publishers has posted it too, and we're really proud of it. I think it's a great cover, but it wasn't supposed to come out yet. So everyone who's been promised a proof is now saying, "So where's the proof?" I said, well, we're about 2 weeks early, thanks to Amazon.
Oh, that's typical. That happened to me with Babes in the Wood. We had no idea what the publication date was, and you know, they couldn't get anything out of Pam Macmillan at all. And then William Shaw, who many people will know, texted me and said, "Oh, congratulations, you got a publication date." Have I? No one had told me. And he said, "Yeah, it's on Amazon." I went on Amazon, and there it was. Contacted my agent. She said, "Oh, I didn't know that either."
Well, it's good to know who's important in the world and who's not, isn't it?
Yeah.
But Graham, Babes in the Wood, was that a case that you were actually involved in as a police officer?
Yeah, I mean, it was. So it spans 30 odd years. So there was a murder of 2 girls in Brighton in 1986. I mean, there's no spoilers because it's absolutely clear about, you know, it's in the public domain who's responsible. 2 little girls sexually assaulted and killed by a chap called Russell Bishop. I wasn't actually in Brighton at the time. I was working in another part of Sussex, but came to Brighton quite soon after he was acquitted. And the book goes into some of the theories about why he was acquitted, because, you know, you'll know as a barrister that you can never know what a jury do or don't decide. You know, I think with this one, you can kind of infer what they would have had time to consider versus some of the other bigger issues, because they acquitted within 2 hours. So, you know,
I didn't realise it was that quick. 2 hours.
Yeah. It was within 2 hours, and there were some hugely complicated points within the prosecution that were rebutted by the defence, or the defence moved to rebut them. I can't imagine a jury being able to having time to consider all those points, but there was a couple of points that there's something that's called a route to verdict, which you know about, which the judge says to the jury, right, okay, in order to find, this is, you know, my sort of summary of it really, in order to find this defendant guilty or not guilty of this particular charge, you must ask yourself these questions. And if the answer is yes, and it works almost like a flow chart, doesn't it? Yes, no, and then
if it's yes to A, then you ask yourself B. If it's no to A, then they're not guilty.
Yeah. And on this one, the very first question was around time of death. If you cannot be sure that the girls were dead by 6:30 in the evening, then you must acquit. And I won't go into all the whys and wherefores, but, you know, frankly, it was very clear that the girls weren't dead by 6:30. So for me, the jury acquitted. Now there was
almost a direction to acquit.
Well, absolutely, and you know, to my mind, that was, you know, the prosecution had set themselves up for that, because that's how they, you know, I've read the judges summing up in detail, and you know, he says this is what the prosecution case is, that they were dead by 6:30. So, you know, you can't really criticise the judge for that.
Yeah.
So I think that was the reason. behind that, there was loads of other things about a particular shirt that the offender was wearing. So anyway, so he was acquitted. Then I came to Brighton very soon after that, and I was a uniformed police constable at the time, and was working the estate where it happened on a daily basis. I was the response car on it, and you could just tell the disrespect, the kind of the hatred of the police. Really, I mean, it wasn't an estate that was particularly in love with the police anyway, but I'd go round to burglaries, domestic disputes, thefts, assaults, and you kind of got this. Look, you couldn't even catch a child killer. How are you gonna solve my burglary?
The resentment that it left was enormous.
Oh yeah, it was horrific, and you just kind of and I you sort of thought, yeah, I can see why you think that. Anyway, 3 or 2 and a bit years after he was acquitted, he went and he kidnapped another girl and took her dumped her in the back boot of his car, took her to a rural area and nearly killed her. And I'd been a detective for a month when that happened, and I was on duty the night it happened. So my active involvement started there, really,
right?
Investigating that case, and he was eventually convicted of that case. But people that have heard me talk before know that most of my career was in Brighton and Hove, and I ended up as as what they call the divisional commander, the borough commander, or as the chief superintendent in charge of policing Brighton and Hove. And every stage through, this case touched me in some way, whether it was, word about the case being reopened. When I became a detective chief inspector there, the year that the double jeopardy law changed. So that was
2003, wasn't it?
It came in 2005, but it was in the 2003 Act, and I, immediate. So this was the law that basically meant that in certain circumstances, people who'd been acquitted of a crime that acquittal could be quashed and they could be they could be retried.
I'm not sure how many people know that's changed, obviously, because double jeopardy is a very famous thing, isn't it? And it's very misunderstood, but it's very famous, mainly thanks to Hitchcock and people like that. But the reality, I mean, until 2005, so until it was the 2003 Act was enacted in 2005, it was the case that you could be acquitted of a crime. You could stand on the steps of court and say, "Yeah, I did that," and you couldn't be charged with it.
Yeah.
And then that changed in 2005, as you say.
Yeah, and it's shocking to think that, and it's a really sort of graphic way that you present that, because that literally could happen. And the best that could happen, and I think it happened in one case, was that somebody who'd given evidence could then be tried for perjury, because that was it. That they could just be tried for perjury with 7 years imprisonment. So, so all the way through this, and the bishop got a life sentence for the attack on the little girl, the second attack, and there was talk about him coming out on parole. So there was always this kind of what's going to happen if Bishop comes out, but also this kind of feeling of failure. Yeah, it was this cloud over us, really. I mean, for goodness sakes, this was one of the most serious, horrific crimes that we'd had in a generation, and we couldn't solve it.
It was a very famous crime nationwide, even, wasn't it? I remember I was very young when the first trial happened, when the murder happened. Murders, pardon me. And I mean, it was a nationally reported thing. It was not unlike Rachel Nickell and things like that, of that size. So what I guess I've never thought about is just how big an impact it would have in a small, not too small, but a small insular place like Brighton. It's a very tight community there, so the impact there would be so exaggerated.
No, it absolutely is, and it was, and the estates that it happened, because it happened on the first murders happened on one estate, and then the snatch happened on another estate. That was almost a kind of a microcosm of that, because the parents were absolutely terrified. Whereas these were estates where children used to go out and play out and enjoy themselves. In fact, both sets of girls were out playing out when it happened to them, unsupervised. All of a sudden, you never saw a child without an adult sort of within about 3 or 4 yards of them. It was, you just think how many children, sort of had part of their childhood robbed by that, and they're innocent, so they're worried about things. But yeah. So then I kind of, you know, I when the case came back to court, I thought, well, it'd be really interesting to research this properly and then writing it from the policing side. So speaking to all the officers that were involved and getting it out there. It's very, I felt a huge responsibility to get it right, write it sensitively, write it accurately, and not be, you know, not be an apologist for policing either. And there's passages in the book where I think police got it wrong or you know, missed a trick. And you know,
so you weren't involved in prosecuting the second time round?
No, I'd left the police by then. But a very
no doubt your contacts and your sources there are pretty exceptional. I mean, given you'd been their boss just a couple of years before.
Absolutely, yeah. And, you know, and there are certain things that I wasn't told and didn't ask before the trial finished. You know, and rightly so, because the last thing I wanted to do was to be the cause of a trial collapsing of this magnitude. But yeah, I mean, you must be very sensitive to that, and I suppose how sacrosanct the judicial process has to be in terms of delivering justice for people.
Yeah, I mean, it's you do have to be so very careful with. It's really difficult now in the age of social media. Really difficult. You have to be very, very careful about giving away anything about a case, because you just don't know what could become important. You don't know what could really matter. And as you say yourself, and I don't know if people understand this, but in this country, sacrosanct is very much the word, certainly of the jury process. If a juror speaks to you and tells you, and after the fact, when it's all said and done, if a juror sits down and tells you how they reached their decision, that's a criminal offence.
Yeah,
it's really very, very strict. It's very different in America, and an awful lot of our views of the law all come from America. You see British TV dramas where a judge has a gavel, which they certainly don't have in this country. People walking around the court and approaching the bench and all that rubbish. And so people's opinions of our legal system are very, very much informed by American fiction. But it's not like that here. It's much more formal here. It is, and I say this as somebody who taught advocacy for a while in the University of Florida. I taught it to state defenders and to public attorneys.
Yeah.
And they're not very good. They're really not very good. So when I say ours is very different, it's better. And very, very sadly, it is going it's going the wrong way. Very sadly, what we had is going very, very much the wrong way. We are very much chasing the American model, and that's a tragedy. Because if you think about what we have exported around the world, our language is first, and second is probably football, and third is most certainly our justice system. America copied it, Australia, Canada, or all of the countries outside of Europe really have got some version of what we created 1,000 years ago. And until 20 years ago, it was absolutely world-beating. And unfortunately, successive governments have destroyed it. But it is still sacrosanct. It does still have, at the highest level, in the Old Bailey, in Southwark, in the major courts, in the Court of Appeal, it still does have that sort of kudos and that level of utmost professionalism. And yeah, it's absolutely sacrosanct. And if you say the wrong thing in the wrong place, and it's a nightmare with social media now, the secret barrister is very good on this. Whenever people start commenting, he or she is on them very, very quickly, saying, look, there are laws. You cannot comment on a live case because you could destroy. And that goes for anyone. That goes for members of the public. You say the wrong thing about a live case, and unfortunately, that live case, you'll see a guilty person walking free. And I'm sure that's the last thing any of us want.
I mean, when I was a DC and before there was social media, if you wanted to ensure that kind of information didn't get out, it was quite simple. You kind of spoke to the press. The press was a defined body of people. You spoke to the TV channels. You spoke to the radio. Now everyone's a journalist, aren't they? And you don't have this ability to lock people down in that way.
And they just hide their agenda behind this claim to be a journalist as well. You look at, for example, Tommy Robinson. I think is a good example of this. He stood outside an ongoing trial and spoke about all the things going on in the ongoing trial. He was arrested. He was put inside. There was uproar about it. And everyone was saying, but he's exposing this thing that's not being dealt with. He's exposing all of the Muslim gangs grooming, and it's not being dealt with. And what people were ignoring was, right, we seem to be live again. I'm not sure if we're live in the same place, so we have the same people. So we'll carry on where we left off, and I'm sure I'll find this on my phone in a moment and be able to see where we are. What were we saying? Yeah, Tommy Robinson, the example that we say about the journalists. We were speaking about journalism and how that's been bastardized, and now everyone's a journalist and their agendas. Yeah, it's not just Fox News with an agenda, it's everyone with a phone and they've got an agenda. And Tommy Robinson's a good example of this because, as I said, there were all the protests about his arrest after he was reporting on a live trial were all based upon, or he's bringing attention to something that's being covered up. They're covering up this grooming that's going on. And they were ignoring the fact that actually he was standing outside trial number 3, which was of the defendants, I think, 10, 11, 12, and 13, of 3 trials of a grooming conspiracy. So to suggest it was being covered up, this had been investigated. They had been charged. There had been charging advice. They had been prosecuted. 2 sets of them had been convicted, which is why there were reporting restrictions on the 3rd. And they were coming to the end of the 3rd trial in which everyone was convicted. And he came so very close to having that trial stopped and to having those rapists walking free. And everyone ignored this. And he was trying to expose this. No, he wasn't. He was trying to get rich and get well known. And this is the problem. You have all of these faux journalists out there with people just deciding not to use their brain and not to actually look for the obvious transparent agenda that was behind what they were doing. And he's just one example, but it's very dangerous. I mean, it's very, very damaging to the justice process.
And do you sense a sort of hardening of attitudes from judges around that? Because they must feel that as angrily as you do, and I do.
Yes, they are getting extremely strict on it. The judge, again, going back to that same case, the judge in Tommy Robinson's case was the second judge to haul him over the coals for this. And the first judge gave him a chapter and verse. This is what you're doing. This is why it's wrong. And these are what the consequences are. So to suggest that in any way that he didn't understand it after that, he would have to be a moron. It could not have been clearer. And he's not a moron. And I can say that because I don't mind admitting this. Under the cab rank rule, we have to take whatever case is offered to us. We're not allowed to turn them down. I've represented that man. So I know he's not a moron. And the reality is, not in that case, in something before that, but the reality is he knew what he was doing. He understood, and he must have understood. So what the judges are now doing are making it so very clear so that when you do it again, then they can hammer you, and they can do so with utter justification. And that's what happened in his case.
Yeah, and rightly so. Are you ever tempted in your books to kind of just seed some of, not necessarily that issue, but seed some of these issues with the criminal justice system into your fiction? So we know, for example, that legal aid has been hugely slashed over the last few years. I mean, The Secret Barrister, I read his or her book, and even as a former police officer, I was shocked about how bad it become since I'd left. But do you ever try and sort of do you ever just kind of hint at some of the changes and some of the negative consequences of this within your book?
I've hinted, and it really is no more than a hint. I hinted at it in Marked for Death. Although Michael Devlin is a barrister, my character Michael Devlin is a criminal barrister. I think in book 1 he just happens to be one, and in book 2 is a bit about, it's kind of about him being a barrister, but it's very slightly rarefied. He's a QC, he's doing things privately. It doesn't really touch him. But in the second one, it's touched upon in the second one. But the problem is, Graham, if I'm honest, it's so depressing. To have grown up wanting to do this job, to have then done this job. I started in 2002, and I was first on my feet in 2002. And it was wonderful. Yeah, we had solicitors sitting behind us in court to support us. It was just exactly what it should be. And then it fell off a cliff. Within 2 years, it fell off a cliff. So I actually saw the end of the great times. And I've just watched it degrade year on year on year at a speed that is terrifying. And I have to say, writing for me is an escape. And that's really why I don't write flat out legal thrillers. I don't write what Steve Kavanagh writes, for example. He writes pure legal thrillers. Mine have some legal background. But as I said earlier, I think my books are probably closer in terms of to James Bond or Jack Reacher or somewhere in between than they are to John Grisham. And I think that's because I need the distraction. And I think if I were to start touching upon it, I think the bitterness would shine through. It would really shine through. And it's not bitterness for me as such, because I have a slightly different career. I started a law firm with a friend of mine. We're kind of insulated from the damage that's been done to a lot of people. That was the intention, and it seems to have worked out. But my bitterness is based upon looking at a career that I loved and looking at a thing that I just found so impressive. I mean, I remember when I first went to Middle Temple, and people might not know about this, but the whole barrister thing goes back so far. I mean, hundreds of years. The Knights Templar used to own the temple in London. It's why it's called the Temple. And back when they were disbanded in 1300 and something, or 1400 and something, it was taken from them and given to the lawyers, and we've been there ever since. And Middle Temple Hall is the only place in the world that we know Shakespeare actually performed a play. It was because it was a premiere of Twelfth Night that occurred in Middle Temple Hall. That's the history we're dealing with. And in 2000, when I started as a trainee barrister, I'd go there and I'd have all these wonderful traditions that go back hundreds of years. And I took my wife and father-in-law and my father-in-law's wife there about 5 years ago, just to show them this, because they love the British history and British tradition, etc. And I was horrified at all the traditions that had changed, these 100 centuries years old things that had been changed in 15 years. It's almost like, well, enough of that.
Yeah.
And it's sad. It's very sad. And if I were to start touching upon it, I think the entertainment value of my books would go out the window, and we just have a not very well written version of The Secret Barrister.
It must be. Yeah, I mean, I suppose doing the job still, you do need a release from it, don't you? And and I think I was going to ask you what you do in your spare time, because you've got this law firm, you're a practicing barrister, you're a dad, you write crime, and I was going to say, well, what do you do in your spare time? But you clearly don't have any. But
absolutely none. No. If I had any spare time, I'd be punching a punch bag, and you can probably see I've not been doing that for a while.
No, I mean it is. I mean, I've got the luxury really of no longer being in my profession, a profession that equally has been sort of decimated. And we've had a chat in the week, didn't we? I've got a novel that's my agent sort of got around at the publishers at the moment, and mine is very much about what could happen if the cuts got so bad. What are the consequences? It's crime fiction.
Yeah.
It's got an impressive body count in there, as you'd expect, but it also talks about some of the it's all driven by some of the issues that we're seeing.
The reality that's coming, not the reality that might come, but the reality that if they carry on, it's coming.
Well, I think when I started writing it, which was about 4 years ago, which is the luxury you have when you're not contracted to finish anything. I was thinking this is kind of 5 years, 6 years in the future. Well, we're getting there now, and the more people I talk about it, the more people say, well, actually, some of that's happening already. So,
well, it must be the most frustrating thing for you guys. The weird thing, I mean, I'm a defence barrister, so technically I'm the other side to you. I've always got on much better with police officers than mostly with the other barristers, to be honest, and because we both realise we're doing a job. And I've spoken to a lot of police officers, and to just watch how disheartened they've become, it's just tragic. A tweet went around, an article. I tweeted a response to an article. There was an article about Priti Patel was suggesting that they're now going to recruit a load of specialists, volunteers. So special constables. We both know they exist. We both know how long they've existed. We both know that it's just another bullshit headline designed to cover up what they've lost.
Yeah.
20,000, they made redundant effectively, or they got rid of 20,000 police officers. That doesn't include, as you know, the people who would have left naturally in that time. And it also doesn't include the people who would not have left naturally in that time, but did leave anyway because it was being made a nightmare. So it isn't a matter of let's recruit 20,000 more. It's actually let's recruit 50,000 more. There's 50,000 that's needed. It's just 20,000 were sacked. So they talk about 20,000. And then when you look at who needs to be recruited, of that 50,000, that's 50,000 with 20 years experience, each man. That's not 50,000 with no experience, each man. No. So now you've got to, they're just not going to be as effective. It's not like for like. They've done such incredible damage, and now they're trying to rectify some of it without any investment at all, and pretend the rest of it hasn't happened. At the moment, they've got this new thing. We're going to criminalize the theft of dogs and the theft of pets, and we're going to create that with a 5-year maximum sentence. The theft of a dog is theft, and it has a 7-year maximum sentence. It is an utterly pointless thing that is designed just to get a headline. You know this as well as I do. Absolutely. And the reality is, if you steal a dog now, it takes so long for anything to come to prison. That's a court, pardon me. It takes so long for anything to come to court that there is a very good chance the dog will have lived its natural lifespan before the investigation and the prosecution are over. And that's what they've created. And that may all sound very glib, but it's true. And that's what they've created. And it's just, for my part, it's sad. And I'm sure for your part, having seen what you've seen, I mean, you were a police officer when you had resources and when you could do the things that were done.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of my former colleagues who left around the same time with me, they rant and rave about how little the police do, and blaming the police officers, blaming the chief constable, blaming. And I kind of say back to them, look, hang on a minute. When we were in, we had those 20,000. We had the, I mean, I
you were allowed to do overtime.
Absolutely, yeah. I had a budget of Brighton and Hove of about £25 million, and that, I mean, including staffing budget. Sometimes the choice was, what are we going to spend it on, rather than how are we going to get to the end? Because we were quite well off, and we were able to do the job. And I think there needs to be an understanding that policing has, like the criminal justice system has been cut and cut, and that's what I'm trying to kind of get across in my book, really.
Yeah.
Get back to books and such like that. So hopefully that will work.
You very kindly sent me a copy of your book. I've not had a chance to read it yet.
No,
we'll get to it, I promise. But are you able to tell us what it's about?
So
and obviously the undercurrent of the cuts and the future of that. But are you able to say anything about the plot? If you're not, don't worry.
So I need to be a little bit careful because it's still doing the round with publishers. But it's effectively what happens when policing cuts are so bad that state-sponsored vigilantism takes over, and it's where the power and the violence and the conflict sits within it. That's not the kind of official blurb. I know I've sent you the official blurb, but I need to be a little bit careful because we're still waiting to hear back from publishers.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about this before. I already knew that, but I thought it might be of interest for people to know.
Yeah.
Because it's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, and certainly my agent likes it. We're talking about it again today. So.
And when you think about it, with what they're suggesting in terms of their new specials, not a million miles from what they're talking about.
No, they're not. No, and I'm not saying that there isn't a place for non-warranted officers, for private security, but we're on a path now where policing is accountable, is regulated. You know as well as I do that if a police officer gets convicted of a criminal offence or even cautioned for a criminal offence, they're out of the job and they're barred from being a police officer for life. Not quite the same in other spheres, and I think the public deserve an accountable and politically independent police as well, which is what we always used to be.
Well, I mean, the politically independent part is something that has disappeared, unfortunately. I just noticed Samantha Brownlee, I think she may have read your book, I think. She said it's a brilliant book, Graham.
Samantha, she has read my novel, because I got her to kind of read it with a reader's eye on it, been through so many drafts, and she came up with a couple of fabulous ideas, which, if it sees the light of day, which I hope it will, she'll get full credit for those, because they're absolutely, they turned it around really. So Samantha does a great job. She's a great proofreader as well. She knows the difference between hyphens and dashes and all sorts of stuff like that.
I don't want to get anywhere near my stuff.
I'm just sitting
I prefer not to know the difference.
No. Samantha, just send it to Samantha. She'll figure it out. I'm just saying. I'm seeing some of the questions in the chat, but not all the ones. I noticed there was one from Andrew earlier, but I can't find it now. I don't know whether that can be pasted in. But Marion's saying she's in Scotland where they have a unified force, and I think longing of the days when they had regional forces. Police Scotland, that changed about 10 years ago, I think, to all the individual forces became Police Scotland. I've not worked in Scotland, but I think there's something to be said about kind of local accountable policing that knows the area. I mean, I used to, I was sort of Brighton, as I said, all the time, and I was very jealous of the policing style that we had in Brighton and that we created. Brighton's a really interesting town. It's got huge issues, massive gaps in wealth and poverty. Drugs death capital of the UK for many years. Hugely political, loads of protests, but it's also a seaside party town, and it takes a long time to create a policing style that manages that and reflects that. And the last thing I ever wanted was somebody coming in from the outside and applying a different, more or less tolerant policing style. I'm not saying that we were, we used to let people get away with things, but you kind of had to know the mood of the city. Yeah. So I'd imagine in a place like Scotland, where you've got, even more diversity, moving people from, Glasgow to Ayr to Edinburgh to Dundee, you're just getting a very kind of vanilla, one-size-fits-all policing.
Yeah. Well, I lived in Scotland for 4 years. I went to university in Dundee, and it was certainly Tay Police back then. The idea that you got the same policing approach in sort of the east end of Glasgow as you would in Inverness is just absurd. Yeah, I mean, I can understand why somebody would be very keen to move away from that. I mean, I deal an awful lot with the Metropolitan Police and also the City of London Police. Yeah, and they're effectively in the same place, and yet they're completely different. And then probably we deal about the same with the National Crime Agency. And again, I mean, they're obviously national, but you can really see the problems with a national police force, although they're not a police force. You can see the problems with the idea of a national police force through the National Crime Agency, because the whole idea of one size fits all right, they're dealing with organised crime, but organised crime in Brighton is very different to organised crime in Liverpool. Yeah, I mean, so it might be the same idea and it might be the same result, but it's certainly not the same approach.
No, and understand, for me, there was a lot about understanding the kind of impact of the policing. So, I remember once we had the counter-terrorist branch came down to Brighton to basically search a house. And I always, we had particularly we had the Metropolitan Police coming down to do anything on us. I'd want to speak to the person in charge and kind of go, okay, what are you doing? How are you going to do it? What's going to happen? Because I knew that they would be back up the A23 by the end of the day, and I'd be picking up the aftermath if they didn't do it very well. And they would kind of make it very, very difficult for me to get any information from them. And I said, look, you're on my division. I don't need to know the intelligence. I don't need to know. I just need to know what you're doing, where you're doing it, and how you're going to do it. Because I'll have to.
And what I need to clean up.
Exactly. Yeah. And luckily there was I think it was a DS that was with them at the time that actually transferred from Sussex and recognised me, and he spoke to the DCI and said, look, I'll brief the chief superintendent. Yeah. And I said to him, you've got to do this because we know the city, and actually we can make things easier for you if you start going in like putting doors in. But we just got a question here, Tony, from Andrew in Nottingham, and he said, talking to someone last week, they wanted to read a crime novel without the police procedural. Can this be done in a crime novel? Surely you have to have police procedural, because how can the villains be caught? Do you want to go at that one, or do you want me to?
I think the answer to that is entirely dependent on how you write it, isn't it? I mean, if you look at a Jack Reacher, some of the Jack Reacher books will have him effectively acting as a detective. and there's no police procedural in that. I think it depends what you're after, Andrew. If you're looking for, I'll be honest, I know an awful lot of police procedure, nowhere near as much as Graham, and I wish I'd spoke to him before releasing Mark for Death, because I've had some stick for a forensic investigation in that one. But the reality is, it depends, I think, on how heightened you want to be. I write heightened thrillers I don't write reality. I write something that you'll read and you'll be happy to accept that it could happen, and you'll be happy to accept it could be reality, but you're not going to learn from it, and hopefully you're going to be entertained from it. Some people write things in which you could basically do a thesis afterwards on police procedural, and I think it just depends on the writer. Some people need Graham's input because they want to be absolutely accurate, and then some of us will kind of skim over it a little bit. So I think you're probably asking the right people, actually, because we come from it from very different ends.
I think you're right, and I advise authors, work with authors on police procedure. I run courses with the Professional Writing Academy on procedure, but I start off every session that I have with an author and every course with, you're going to learn a lot of stuff. Please don't write it all down in your books, because my take on it is that policing and procedure is very, very dull. But if you know how it works in real life, then you can then take a creative decision as to how far you move from that. If you think, for example, that the detective chief superintendent is going to be sitting in an interview room interviewing somebody for an armed robbery, you need someone like me. But actually, do you need to say anything about that interview at all, other than the fact that this person was interviewed? So the thing I say is, you don't have to get it right, but don't get it wrong. So skim over as much as you can. Every line, every word that you write has to take your characters forward and your plot forward. And the procedure won't always do that, but know what it is, so you know what you need to dip into and what you don't.
Yeah.
If you are going to dip into it, you do need to get it right.
Yeah. No, I agree entirely. I have when I research things, I have a strange way of researching it, and it's based entirely upon the fact that I know myself. I know the kind of character I am, and if I know something, I will really want you to know that I know it. I think I'm basically just a massive know-it-all, and because of that, I don't do any research on most subjects until I finish my first draft. I'll write things in such a way as I imagine. I always think this: the world has been run by very clever people for a very long time. They've probably done things right, and therefore, if it's logical to me, that's probably kind of how it works. And so far, that's been accurate. And the reason that I do that is I then basically I'll write the first draft, then I'll go back and do the research, and I'll correct anything that I've got wrong. But I won't add things. Whereas if I did the research first of all, I'd go down a rabbit hole. And when I wrote Killer Intent, there's a scene where Joshua, the one of the bad guys, goes for a run in Hyde Park, and I wrote 3 pages on the Achilles statue, because I love the Achilles statue, and I've done a lot of research on it, and it's all from the Battle of Waterloo and the cannons, etc., etc. And I wrote all about it, and my editor was saying, "What is this? What's this shit?"
I know it. Tell you about it.
So I made a decision then: stop researching. Write it as you imagine it would be, and then make sure you're right. And if you're not right, correct yourself, but don't add more detail. And I think it's very much the same with police procedure, depending on who you are as a writer. Some people can make it so compelling. I mean, you say police procedure is boring, court procedure is boring. I mean, when you get into the nitty gritty, like police procedure, there are bits of it that are fantastically compelling, and you want that in your book. But the stuff that ties it all together is just the stuff that ties it all together. And that's never interesting. A ligament is never interesting. And so don't include it.
No. I mean, when I was, I'd almost written Babes in the Wood just before the second trial, the retrial, and my publishers were saying, "Oh, great, get us the trial. I knew it's going to be a long trial. Get us the drama of the trial. Get us." And I was thinking, there ain't going to be much drama going on. There'll be a lot of people explaining, different types of paint and different, how DNA is extracted from, various surfaces and that. I mean, there was.
Who defended that trial, by the way, Graham?
Joel Ben Nathan.
You did tell me this.
Yeah, and Brian Altman prosecuted, as you know. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I mean, it's, you know, and I think if your books are character driven, I mean, I know Mark Craven's on the channel. He certainly was earlier. You know, you look at you look at Washington Poe and Tilly, and you know, I don't probably the National Crime Agency don't investigate like that, but who cares, because they're brilliant characters, and Mike's plots are just amazingly dark and twisty, and you know, with a little bit of humour. And I don't care whether that's accurate, because I'll read his books as long as he's going to keep writing them.
But that's exactly, it's about the choice, isn't it, between entertainment and reality? And and I came slightly late to Mike's books and just devoured them because they're just incredible. They are fantastic. They're kind of, as a writer, they're the sort of books you look at and just say, bastard, how do you write that? And
we invoice fantastic. We're going to invoice Mike after this, I think.
Absolutely. I've been texting as we speak. I was just looking. Laura Hamilton's asked a question in the stream as well. Laura watched a documentary where Ted Bundy's lawyer said that Ted had confessed to other murders the police hadn't linked him to. Due to attorney-client privilege, he couldn't say anything until Ted died. Would a UK defence solicitor have the same problem? Yep, and a UK defence solicitor and barrister. Attorney-client privilege is almost absolute, unless they waive it, which is rare. Weirdly enough, someone waived it in court today, which I think is only the third time that's ever happened to me, and that was, you know, in a 20-year career, third time today. But if there's something going to happen, if there is a crime going to be committed, it doesn't apply. So if we were to know that somebody was going to commit a murder, we could tell the police. But knowing they've committed a murder, we could not. What is interesting, though, because it follows on from that, is a lot of people have the view that how can you defend somebody who, when you know they're guilty, when they've told you they're guilty? If someone tells us they're guilty, we can't defend them. Well, we can, but not properly. Our first duty is to the court. So if my client says to me, well, I did kill this guy, but I want you to go in there and say I didn't, I can't go and say he didn't. I can't suggest to the court that he didn't do it. What I can, as far as I can go, is what's called putting the Crown to proof. And what we'll basically say is, prove your case. And we can challenge things like continuity, and we can challenge where one exhibit went and where it went for how long, and was there a chance that somebody may have corrupted it, and all these small little things. But we can't stand in front of a jury and say, my client did not do this, you should find him not guilty. We're not allowed. So it's a myth, really, where people think that we do that we make up defences. We don't. I really wish sometimes we could, because I have stood in front of juries, and I have a weird thing that is actually not uncommon amongst barristers, which is by the time I've got to make a speech, I will have convinced myself my client's account is a good one. No matter how, I have had occasions where on a Monday I'll be saying, you cannot run this defence, you must plead guilty, you cannot win this case. And by the Friday you're making a speech thinking, I'm smashing this. And then 2 hours after you've made the speech, reality kicks in and you remember that actually it's awful. But you have to kind of convince yourself that you've got a chance in order to be able to make the passionate speech you have to make, or certainly the passionate speeches that I tend to make. And but if you know they're guilty, so suspecting they're guilty and having a good inkling they're guilty, and all those things aren't knowing. I mean, who are we to say whether they're guilty or not? We might think they are. We might think everything adds up, but it's not really our decision. It's a jury's decision. But if they tell us they've done it, if we know they've done it in the sense that they confessed, then they need a new lawyer.
Mm. And I think that's a really important part of the system, because it might surprise people. Obviously, as you said earlier, you could argue that I'm on the other side, but I think we're both on the side of justice, to sort of use a cliche. I expected as an investigator to prove my case beyond reasonable doubt. Because if I got it right, that person was generally going to prison for a very long time. Their life would change forever. Their family's life would change forever. They'd lose their home. All of that. So, I wanted the system to test what I'd done, because if there was any doubt at all, then however strong my feelings, which is as you were saying, however strong my feelings, it wasn't enough. And so I kind of I've asked barristers that question before: how can you defend a a person you know to be guilty and heard similar answers. But at the end of the day, the system relies on proof beyond reasonable doubt, and that's common in most democracies as well. But it's one of those things that if I was in trouble, I'd want that system. I'd want to put the crown to proof. I'd want to make sure that the evidence was tested.
The reality is, innocent people are charged. It doesn't happen all that often, but innocent people are charged. You look at Barry George, you look at Colin Stagg, isn't it, the recent TV show?
Yeah.
My old head of chambers defended Colin Stagg. The head of my former chambers now, along with Brian Altman, defended him also, Bill Clegg and Jim Sturman, QCs. And when they had him acquitted of that case, when that case was thrown out because of the honey trap, the officer in the case stood outside and effectively said, these men have, the lawyers have manipulated the system to see a guilty man go free. And that stuck to Colin Stagg. That mud stuck for many, many years until the confession of the man that had actually killed her. And that confession wasn't sort of a crazy confession. It was a confession based on DNA evidence that proved he'd killed her. So that poor man, again, just one example, and it's not as uncommon as people think. It's not that common either, I'll be in fairness, but it's not as uncommon as people think. That poor man's life was ruined, absolutely ruined. Barry George, or Barry Balsara, as he called himself, Jill Dando. Again, Bill Clegg QC defended him. Defended him ultimately in the successful appeal. These things do happen, and they do happen, and there is a very significant place for defence barristers. And what's very worrying is you have to question where they're going to come from in the next generation, because at the moment, the young defence barristers, I'm going to say something that's again going to sound glib, but it's completely true. And please believe me, it's completely true. Under 30 years of age, if a young barrister has started sort of at 22, 23, up until the age of 30, a barrister will almost certainly earn less than a barista at Starbucks. And that's with all of the various debts, etc. So the problem is, who's going to come into that career? What person who can go and earn a living elsewhere is going to come and earn minimum wage for a career that takes over your life? When I started, we were paid well. And we were paid well enough to justify what we had to do, and the kind of work and the kind of hours and the kind of commitment. We were paid well enough for it. They're not now. Simple as that. And so you have to wonder, with this incredibly important role, and it is an incredibly important role, as is the police, as is the prosecution, as is everything within the system, who's going to do it? And when you think about who's going to do it, remember, that's where our judges come from. So 25 years down the line, who the hell are our judges going to be? It's terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying.
It really is. And that's one of the things that really shocked me in the Secret Barristers book, that comparison is just scary, because I was from an era where, I sort of joked with you in an email this week, didn't I, that you're all kind of wine quaffing, golf course,
and we were.
Tops. And you were, well, not you, obviously, because you were.
No, listen. I came from a council estate. I became a barrister at 22. By 24, I was a proper snob. and then they cut our money, and I became working class again.
Yeah. At least you knew where you were going to from there. But it's shocking, isn't it? Because people's liberty depends on it. And if I get it wrong as a police officer, and the defence barrister is substandard, how many more Barry George, Colin Staggs are there going to be? Because the system isn't geared up to give people a proper defence and call out my mistakes as an investigator.
Exactly. I'm just seeing whether these are questions we've got coming up.
David Costa.
David Costa. Which do you enjoy more, Live Twice or Thunderball?
I think another is.
Got to be. Ooh. Do you know what? Neither one of them's the great one. I couldn't get From Russia with Love is the one I wanted, and I couldn't get it, Dave, because I bought these. We were just talking about how we earned okay when I first started. When I first started, I'd had no money my entire life, and then I got my first check, and it was, for me back then, it was life changing. The first thing I did was went and bought my mum a nice picture, and in the same shop I saw these, and I bought these there. I was always a massive James Bond fan, and they're originals from the cinema. all framed and signed and perfect. And yeah, they were stupidly expensive for what they were. And they're not even the films that I love. It's the Bond I love, but it's not the films that I love. Really, I'd like to, preferably Dr. No and From Russia with Love.
Yeah. Someone's put in there. There's a lack of funding at all levels, though, isn't there? No, there absolutely is. You know, I mean, I do work in safeguarding and social care is underfunded, and national health is everywhere is underfunded, and you know the answer comes from sensible politicians and, you know, unfortunately taxes and people paying their taxes as well. So
they are absolutely right about that. But one thing I'd say before we get cut off is, and this is not because I'm in that industry, it's just because it's true. You say everywhere is underfunded. That's absolutely right. They need to fund more. Nowhere comes close to criminal justice. We argue about whether there should be a 1% or a 3% pay rise for nurses and however much for doctors. In 1997, that was the last time that there was a pay increase for lawyers on the legal aid. 1997. Since 1997, it's been cut by 60%. So not in real terms, but in pound for pound, we receive now 60% less pound for pound than we received in 1997. So that's got to be at least 80% less when you include inflation. So instead of arguing about, will we get 1% this year or 2% this year, we get nothing every year apart from the occasional kick in the nuts when they say, do you know what, we're going to take away another 3%, we're going to take away another 10%. It's happening every third year or so. I don't do legal aid anymore. I'm purely private defence. I come from a background of a working class boy from a council estate. I wanted to defend people with my background. Because I come from my background, I can't afford to defend people from my background because I need to earn a living. And that's a tragedy. The only people who can afford to do our job now are people who were born rich. And frankly, that doesn't mean they're all terrible, because some of them are very bright, but a lot of them aren't.
That's a very, very sober message to probably to end on. But
sorry about that.
Thank goodness you had the escape of writing brilliant books. And when's your new one out? November?
November 18th.
November 18th. And
November 18th. No, it's called No Way to Die, which is, we realise, very close to No Time to Die, which is the next Bond film. And that may not be an accident.
Oh, well, best of luck with it, Tony. And I've loved our chat. We could go on forever, I know. And I know
we could. I'm looking at the time thinking, how much longer can we do? But I know we'll be in trouble.
Yeah. But hopefully we'll probably be able to tell people a bit of space. We might be doing a bit of work together anyway soon, mightn't we? So
I would love that. That would be wonderful. We can talk about that afterwards, because I've made some inquiries for you.
Oh, lovely. Oh, great. That's that'd be great. So fabulous.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks for the questions.
Caroline, are we